Features of ethnographic research. People's behavior is studied in everyday contexts rather than under conditions created by the researcher, such as in experiments. Data are gathered from a range of sources, but observation and relatively informal conversations are usually the main ones. The approach to data collection is unstructured in the sense that it does not involve following through a detailed plan set up at the beginning, nor are the categories used for interpreting what people say and do entirely pre-given or fixed. This does not mean that the research is unsystematic, simply that initially the data are collected in as raw a form and on as wide a front as it feasible. The focus is usually a small number of cases, perhaps a single setting or a group of people, or relatively small scale. Indeed, in life history research, the focus may even be a single individual. The analysis of data involves interpretation of the meanings and functions of human actions and mainly takes the form of verbal descriptions and explanations, with quantification and statistical analysis playing a subordinate role at most. Ethnography is less technical than approaches in experiment or social survey. The origins of ethnography lie in the writings of travelers concerned to inform their fellows about other societies. The writing of early people from history and those disciplines are called social or cultural anthropology. Through influence of Bronisley, and it came to be required that anthropologists live among the people being studied. Studies using ethnographic methods started in Chicago, and that is where the ethnographic method is socially and anthropologically emerged, which was called the community study. The ethnographic research grew in the 1960s in the US around studying deviant groups. Methodological debates about ethnography include those centering on criticisms of ethnography for not meeting the criteria assumed to be characteristic of science. Also, those concerned with arguments that ethnography has not broken sharply enough with or moved far enough away from quantitative research and the model of natural science. The assumptions distinctive to ethnography are three. So the first one is naturalism, the view that the aim of social research is to capture the character of naturally occurring human behavior, and that this only can be achieved by first-hand contact with, not by inferences from what people do in artificial settings such as experiments, or from what they say in interviews about what they do in other settings. Understanding is central here in the argument that human action differs from the behavior of physical objects and even from that of other animals. It does not consist simply of fixed responses or even of learned responses to stimuli, but involves interpretation of stimuli and the construction of responses. For the discovery, a feature of ethnographic thinking is a conception of the research process as inductive or discovery-based, rather than as being limited to the testing of explicit hypotheses. Ethnographers rarely begin their research with specific hypotheses. Rather, they have a general interest in some type of social phenomena and or in some theoretical issue or practical problem. The three are specific features of ethnographic method. They are also the basis for much ethnographic criticism of quantitative research for failing to capture the true nature of human social behavior, because it relies on the study of artificial settings and or what people say rather than what they do, because it seeks to reduce meanings to what is observable, and because it refines social phenomena by treating them as more clearly defined and static than they are, and as mechanical products of social and psychological factors. The most influential texts in criminology and certainly in the urban sociology are based on ethnographic methods. So some examples would be William from the White Street Corner, which was a case study written in the 1940s of life and social structure in an Italian-American slum. He learned Italian specially and hung out with what was called corner boys just to help describe their relationships with each other, what they did in their leisure time, and their involvement in various forms of illicit activity. A more recent example would be Mitch Jr.'s Sidewalk. Sidewalk is a book about men selling books, magazines, and other scavenged goods on tables on the pavement of Greenwich Village in New York. And then, even more recently, Body and Soul by Leoc. Recount is a really interesting account of him getting to know the black neighborhood, predominantly black neighborhood in Chicago, having signed up to a boxing gym in the local neighborhood. So he immersed himself in the boxing gym, and that was his sort of entry point to understanding the wider community. And these sorts of books are really worth looking at if you want to get a flavor of what ethnographic research is and what it can offer. What is it that quantitative research tends to entail? Because ethnography is a form of qualitative research. And the first thing to say is that its primary aim is generally to capture the social world as it is experienced by participants themselves. So what does that mean? It means trying to really get underneath the skin of what people think, how they perceive the world around them, how they reflect on the world, how they interpret it, how they therefore interact with each other in social situations. And so a good deal of what this means is that we try to understand and describe the world from someone else's point of view. And that generally means ethnographic methods involve not trying to impose our own academic categories on other people's experiences too prematurely. So rather than using things like survey, is where we would use academics so to slightly sort of try scholarly language to try to understand the world. And of course, there is nothing wrong with that at all. Rather than doing that, we would embrace the complexity and mass of other people's world by also their labels, language, categorizations, and so on. Secondly, the language of variables and hypotheses appear only quite rarely in qualitative literature. So whereas quantitative research tends to develop and test a specific hypothesis in order to understand the correlations and connections between different variables in qualitative research, it's more likely that you're exploring an issue that seems unclear or open. So generally we feel that we don't know enough before we begin our fieldwork to establish a meaningful hypothesis. In a way, this is about asking questions rather than answering them. Obviously, answering them comes as part of the process, but it means it's better to talk about research concerns than hypothesis. If you're wishing to writing up a qualitative piece of work, don't talk about hypothesis first. The focus of qualitative research is largely to authentically capture a social life or personal experience. So to dig deep into a culture or phenomenon, or to provide a starting point for further analysis in situations where not much is known yet about a subject, and so it's just worth saying I think it's very helpful to think about a kind of cycle of research whereby quite often ethnographic work is discovery. Work helps us understand things that we don't understand at all and describe them in a lot of depth and detail. And then we ought to happen, though this often doesn't happen, is that people use those descriptive accounts as the basis for more tailored, focused, specific hypothesis testing and forth. An essential component of qualitative research is that it tries to understand the subjective viewpoint of the person or people being studied, how they see the world, and that doesn't mean accepting that someone else's truth is the truth of the situation, just that the starting point is to understand the world and what the world is like if you walk in someone else's shoes. Qualitative studies seem to benefit from depth of understanding, even if it comes at the expense of breadth of understanding or generalizability. So generally, samples in ethnographic work tend to be small, but the idea is to delve really deeply, to mine down into a community or into other people's worlds, and then to provide a lifelike, holistic, grounded account. So that's very often. That's why it takes a long time sometimes to do this kind of work, because the whole point is to really get to know it. Sometimes what's said is that the point at which you can tell what you've got, there is when you understand everything about the world you're interacting in, and you can use other people's language. Ethnographic work and interviewing take advantage of flexible research designs. So that means that you have to live with and ideally embrace a certain amount of uncertainty. What I mean by that is that whereas with, let's say, survey-based research, you design your survey and you give it out, and you can't amend it once you get going, because the whole point is that your questions have to be the same each time with qualitative work. And ethnography is a form of qualitative work. New flexibility means that you follow your nose a bit. There are things that turn out to be interesting that you couldn't have anticipated, and we think of this as surprise data, and surprise data, so serendipitous findings. That's often a really important part of this form of work. Again, you remember, you often don't know enough in advance to know exactly what you're looking for, but gradually it becomes more clear and what the interesting phenomena are. And then you follow those things up. This also means that the process of data collection and analysis take place at the same time. So, right from the start, you might be thinking about hunches, tentative ideas, and so on, and you get to sort of check them out as you go along. You can't eliminate your own subjectivity. So in quantitative work, the model tends to be that the researcher should be as distanced as possible from its terms of influencing what goes on in the sort of data collection process. That doesn't work in qualitative work. If I'm interviewing someone, then it should be very obvious that part of what comes out of the interview it's to do with the nature of my interactions with the interviewee. And so for some, that is a weakness of qualitative work, but it begs the question, how do we know that what I get told by people is the same as what you might get told by people? How much might that be affected by gender, age, ethnicity, and so on? What qualitative researchers tend to say is, well, that's something that you need to be transparent about, that you need to reflect upon, and that you use almost as a tool. So you have to think about your personal characteristics might shape what people tell you, but you can't pretend you're not there. You can't, and you can't. When you're interviewing, for example, trying to be as blank and neutral as possible, but people won't talk to you if you come across like that, because you'll look like a robot rather than a human. So why collect qualitative data? They are a source of well-rounded, rich descriptions and explanations of process in identifiable local contexts. With qualitative data, one can preserve chronological flow, see precisely which events lead to which consequences, and derive fruitful explanations than do good qualitative data, and more likely to lead to serendipitous findings and new integrations. They help researchers get beyond initial conceptions and generate or revise conceptual frameworks. Finally, the findings from qualitative studies have a quality of undeniable, glitzy words, specially organized incidents and stories have a concrete and vivid, meaningful flavor that often proves far more convincing to a reader. So the emphasis here is on grounded data. So we try to collect data in natural circumstances, certainly with ethnographic work. Not trying to bring people into a laboratory and see how the behavior works that I'm not giving out. So that is getting people to classify their views. The second thing is to emphasize here is rich description. That really good ethnographic work transports you effectively to the environment that where the fieldwork was conducted. You try to describe the environment, what it looks like, what it smells like, how people interact. The qualitative work, quotations from people, descriptions of the environment provides hooks because they give a flavor. They provide stories, and all of them is very important in helping people understand what you're describing to them. So this is from Howard Becker, a very famous ethnographer. He says the participant observer, and people use this term participant observation almost interchangeably with ethnography. The participant observer devastated by participating in the daily life of the group or organization he studies. Obviously, he or she watches the people he or she is studying to see what situations they ordinarily meet and how they behave in them. He or she returns into conversation with some or all of the participants in the situations and discovers their interpretation of the events he or she has observed. So note the emphasis here on ordinary situations. What is everyday life like in a particular community or the particular place? And then the second quote, this is from a large Anderson again, very famous urban ethnographer. He says urban ethnographics typically embeds themselves in a local setting or a community with the express purpose of learning about the people reside. Of particular interest is how residents meet the exigencies of life, how they group themselves socially, and how they arrive at their shared understandings of the local system of rules of everyday life. In other words, what are their norms? How do they understand the world? And how do they act in it? Every day, the subject's responses to meaningful questions about the immediate problems of living revealed much about the social order, or what Clifford Gates labels their community's local knowledge. One thing you might want to think about is which academic tradition are most associated with this form of work, and I think the answer to that is anthropology. So typically in anthropological research, academics would travel to other cultures, communities, and so on, and would try to sort of get inside them, often living there for months on end, and trying to understand what are the ways in which people live their lives, what are their shared values, what is considered appropriate and inappropriate in terms of people's conduct. And of course, a good deal of sociology is just sort of native anthropology. Where could you do ethnographic work? So you could do this kind of work with drug unit users, violence amongst ice hockey players, everyday rules, informal rules held by police officers, and so on. So let's continue talking about some of the basic characteristics here. One is that the world that you try to study, the world in it, natural, everyday setting, and often by immersing yourself in other people's world. So the focus is daily behavior as it occurs naturally rather than behavior as it might occur in an artificial setting like a lab or measured using artificial tools like surveys, which in the terms of the scholar, not necessarily using the language that people would naturally use themselves, and therefore proponents of ethnographic work tend to argue that it is superior form of data collection because it's least artificial. It measures real human activity, so the argument is that methods of research are instruments designed to approximate the real world, which means that always inferior to just going out there and seeing the real world as it takes place. And I should say that ethnographic accounts that we've tried to produce what the world feels like, how it actually occurs through their descriptions and through the forms of writing, lots of descriptions, lots of quotations, and so that that you're showing the reader the forms of language and expression and other people use there, that natural reasoning and so on. So what that means is that ethnographic work is much better as description than casual explanation. Ethnographic accounts typically try to explore and explain the meanings that people give to their actions, and these are often the meanings that outsiders might consider to be hard to understand or even irrational. It tends to be fairly unstructured, flexible data and collection process. Often what that means is that you start off with quite broad aims that then narrow down a bit as you go along. So on the one hand, it's normally a less systematic form of research than quantitative research is. That makes it quite hard to explain to people. It's not just about a series of technical skills or actions. That doesn't mean it's easy. It's a very demanding way to do research. It takes a lot of time. It's exhausting. You're trying to understand something that by definition you start off not understanding. That's sometimes quite a lot of personal risk involved. It's often going into environments with which you are unfamiliar, and that can bring risk. And it requires quite a lot of very careful note taking and rule negotiations to do. So tends to generate a lot of material in the form of things like field notes. Generally, this form of research is inductive. In other words, you build up theory rather than starting off with hypotheses derived from a theory. So Humphreys argues this is a quote hypothesis should develop out of ethnographic work rather than providing restrictions and distortions from its inception. And Howard Becker says field workers, this is another quote, they do not know enough about an area priori right to identify relevant problems and hypotheses, and that they must discover these in the course of their research. The main techniques of ethnographic research tend to be observation, informal conversations, and interviews. And some people do say that the best way of describing ethnographic research is deep, hanging around, spending a lot of time somewhere absorbing the atmosphere, building up relationships, chatting to people to find out what they think about that life, how they relate to other people, what kinds of social networks they're in. Researchers rely on small numbers of informants, not such a great word to use, however, they help you understand what it is you're seeing and hearing. And finally, often they are a very small number of cases for reasons I've explained, that generally you're trying to get to know one or two places really well, and rather than trying to have a large number of cases that you can't possibly get to know so well. So why do ethnographic research? Well, the first reason is that you might be interested in a specific setting, so a police station, or you might be interested in demonstrations or crowd behavior. And what that means is you might be interested in a particular kind of organization, Ministry of Justice, for example. And so you want to see these places or these settings or these forms of behavior as they are. So again, this is linked to the fact that ethnographic research is the least artificial way of trying to understand a phenomenon. But it means if you're interested in body language, for example, it might be particularly effective way of understanding this. But also one thing that's really important to understand is that interviewing people tells you more about their attitudes than their conduct and so on. Reason why I like both observe and what goes on in an environment, but also interview people, is that you get the sense of both. Of when you interview people in private, they tell you a lot about what they think, what their attitudes are, but that's not always the same as how they act, which are more likely to see. If you're just hanging around watching how people interact with each other in both of the cases, you're interested in getting beneath the surface of official figures or environments that are otherwise hard to understand or infiltrate, and even getting beneath the surface of people's explanations. Because, as I've said, part of what you're doing is seeing how people act rather than just how they say they act or just what they think. And as I've said, this gap between attitudes and behavior is absolutely key. Again, one thing it might be worth thinking about is what the distinction between what people say they like or believe in, or what people say about what they do. We should use scientific methods, but I think what's more complicated here is that the social forces can act on people through their own interpretations, cultural assumptions, and so on. And indeed, one of the core tasks of ethnography is to understand what those cultural assumptions are, how it is that when things go on around us, we interpret those things and sort of act upon them. So the key premise of qualitative work generally is that people act towards things on the basis of the meanings that the things have for them, and that these meanings derive from social interactions with your peer groups, with your social group, and so on, and that these things also can change. These things are not static, so there is an unpredictable quality of social life. We're never compelled to make particular choices because we don't know, we don't carry predetermined laws and rules within us. I guess the other way I might put that is, if we put two chemicals into a test tube and shake the test tube, we can be pretty confident of the reaction that will occur if we put two people in a room. Even people whose behavior we think is reasonably predictable to us, we don't know the complexity of human interaction. It's such that it's very difficult to predict what will have gone on when we open the door and find out what's happened. There's also something important here about going straight to the source. So Herbert Blumer in 1969 argued that all social scientists attribute through theory or observation point of view to the people they analyze. So if they're doing maths, he said, why not just go and find out direct from the people that you're speculating about? So when we are trying to understand something like teenage pregnancy rates and what it correlates, and as it, instead of just making claims about what teenage girls must be thinking in order that they get pregnant at an early age, why don't we just go and ask them about what's shaping their decision making, saying that drug users? Why doesn't it make sense to make assumptions about the motivations of other people without just going and directly asking them? It's not that I think that people can always explain their decision making in a perfect way, and of course people are shaped by social forces. It's just that people might be quite good witnesses or might give quite good accounts of what it is that is shaping their decision making. Sociologists who lean on external accounts and objective evidence can have no appreciation of why people act. Neither can they understand environments and history as their subjects do. So the point being made here is that there is something about being there, feeling the environment, experiencing it yourself, that helps you understand other people's behavior. So if you're studying homeless people or homelessness, then I'm sure you can see why giving out surveys would feel like a very old research or odd research strategy. Whereas getting alongside people, chatting to them, getting to know them slowly seems like a much more sensible strategy. Or your study might be exploratory. So if there's very little research already out there on the topic, it can be very effective to do ethnographic work just as a way of providing a broad description of the phenomena rather than trying to test a hypothesis. Because if you don't know much to begin with, you're unlikely to be able to generate the right hypothesis or the hypotheses that are worth testing. There might be ethical reasons why you undertake ethnographic research. So lots of ethnographies believe that it is less objectifying, more respectful way of undertaking research because it allows more scope of collaboration, because it represents people's voices on their own terms. It's because ethnographic research is often a balance. It's often research with people who are whose worlds are not well understood, or who may be rather invisible to the wider society and so on. So it's partly about representing people, but the point I'm trying to make here is that it's a research method that tries to reduce the distance between research and research subjects, and also the aims of is often to humanize other people, to unpick or challenge moral simplicities, to recognize people as complex beings with reasons behind their actions. The capacity of urban ethnography to humanize its subjects is one of the greatest strengths, providing an important antidote to the opposite tendencies amongst theorists of both the left and the right, and the left to depict such people only in abstract terms, devoid of the quintessentially human qualities. To talk a bit about some of the problems and limitations and dilemmas of ethnographic work, the first is a question about the degree to which we should be faithful to what people say their motives are. If there's a risk or naivety here, that there's a risk that, well, firstly, people aren't always fully aware of their motives, or they can't provide the full explanation of why things are happening in the way they are. In the same way that people that plays pool or snooker doesn't need to understand the Newtonian mechanics to be able to understand to be a good player. You don't need to understand the forces that shape what is it that you're doing. And similarly, when people, if you were to just go and ask people why they commit crimes, there are things that might be able to tell you to do with what their immediate motivations are, but those might not be full explanations because we don't have full sight of all of the forces that shape us. And similarly, if someone says to you that the reason why they engaged in a fight, a physical assault, or someone else, and they say I did it because the devil told me to do it, well, that voice in their head might be very meaningful to them. But you wouldn't generally say that their explanation is the true explanation. We wouldn't say that the assault happened because the devil made them do it, told them to do it. But of course, what we need to do then is to explain what the connection is between the wider environment and the fact that they are hearing voices that tell them to do something. It's also the case that if you think about something like the age crime curve, which tells us about that people get older, generally they're less likely to engage in offending. If we asked people why they were stopping offending, they wouldn't say to us that it's because of the age crime relationship. They might talk about changes in their attitudes and behaviors without recognizing that the role of age or maturity have played in these shifts. So we need different kinds of data sometimes to undo if you're trying to understand causal patterns, and some ethnographies do believe that you should study what people say that they're doing without trying to further interpret this, without trying to impose your own framework. But that may mean that you only capture the surface of what's really going on rather than the underlying reasons. So there are often underlying causal patterns, and ethnography isn't very good and always understanding that entirely. And at the same time, we need to do some interpretation. Ethnography isn't just the same as leaving a camera running in a room and then just shoving that to students or other scholars. There's always some interpretation going on. Generalizability, there is an issue sometimes with that it focuses in the graphic work on just one or two cases, or sites or communities, that you can't really tell how generalizable that will be. And obviously, one advantage of quantitative work when it involves large numbers is that you can generalize with more confidence. So this is to do with the trade-off between the depth and the breadth of understanding.